can call it the Great Indian Lockdown that happened 1 year back, today was the first day that India went into, I think, world's most strict lockdown, putting 1.35 billion people into their homes, locking them up almost for 8 weeks. Sanjeev, I'll start with you. Today, I mean, it's 1 year back, whatever happened, but how do you reflect on that? Whatever your actions government took at that point in time, and at a very short notice, the most stringent lockdown on the planet was announced.
So you're absolutely right. It's exactly 1 year since we went into that big lockdown. And reflecting on it, I would argue that we did exactly the right thing, given the information that we had at that time. So let me explain. As you just mentioned, both Nassim and I are complexity theory people. And one of the points about complexity theory is that we believe in how to deal with decision-making in an environment of utter uncertainty. And that's the situation we were in a year ago. We knew that something bad had happened in China. It had spread to Italy. But beyond that, we had very little information. And the experts and virologists of that time gave us a very wide range of possible outcomes. So in that environment, the best thing we thought was to do is to do a full lockdown in order to hedge for the worst possible outcome that could happen. Now that gave us some time to gather information, create some quarantining, testing, and other kinds of facilities. But once we had sort of better information, please notice, we also began to step-by-step opening things up through a Bayesian updating of information. So I think, given the information we had at that time, the lockdown was the right thing to do. After all, the virus may well have turned out to be just as bad as the worst-case scenarios were predicting them to be. We had no way of knowing whether it would be. And we did exactly the same thing with the economic response as well, if you remember. We were under tremendous pressure to do these grand stimuluses, trillions of dollars, etc., which some other countries trotted out. But our view right in the beginning was that this was not a sprint. It was a marathon where we would have all kinds of unintended consequences and butterfly effects taking place. So in that environment, it made sense to make your way through more carefully through a sequence of medium-sized packages, which we ramped up over time. But also remember, we changed the nature of them. I mean, in the beginning, they were much more about providing a safety net. So, free food, providing 100% guarantees to the MSMEs, things like that, because that's more of a safety net approach. But over time, as things were opened up, we then switched to ramping up demand. But at every stage, we again did something very different from other countries. We also put in a lot of effort into supply-side measures, and which, again, reflects our view that we are dealing with uncertainty. We need to continuously invest into making the system more flexible and be able to respond in this step-by-step kind of way.
Nassim, you have a very interesting view on, the way governments have responded to COVID. And you yourself are a COVID survivor, so you know the disease, I think, much better than a lot of people who comment on it. How would you rate the Indian response, the way India reacted to COVID?
I would say they did what a wise government should do, which is, in the absence of information, you don't take risks. You just make sure that you're minimizing risks. We had no idea what this disease was about. And then, as my friend here, Sanjeev, explained, as you gain more information, then you relax the measures. You see, if I have absolutely no idea about the safety of the plane, I ground it. And then as I get more information about the plane, I will, let it fly with caution. So basically, that's a precautionary principle. And I think that that measure was extremely wise. And I wish, as a matter of fact, we had such wisdom here, because in the United States, we had a severe problem. It took us an entire year before the federal government mandated PCRs at the border, which could have solved the problem and saved trillions of dollars. So basically, sometimes even from an economic standpoint, acting quickly can help you in the long run. And then let me warn about one thing: the hindsight explanation. After a fact, I didn't need. I wasn't sick last year. I didn't need health insurance after the fact. Okay, so I paid so much money for nothing. Yeah, it was wasted. It's the same argument can be used in any situation where someone is acting in a precautionary way by having, the equivalent of insurance, which is taking for enacting measures and of course measures and policies that are there to minimize risk for the population.
Right. I think that's a compliment for you, because he was saying that, he wishes that the other governments, including US, would have responded the way India did. I'll come back to you, Sanjeev. But Nassim, what I want to know is, since the time pandemic began, everybody has been talking about, was this a black swan event? So many people have referred to your books. And so first of all, what are your comments? Was this a black swan event? If yes, why? If no, why?
I see. I have a little 12 minutes presentation explaining the thinking that was in the Black Swan, how I explained in the Black Swan that, of course, it wouldn't be a Black Swan event. It was the Black Swan itself on page 307 explain tells you that this is almost unavoidable because of the structure of the world in which we live today. So let me quickly, may I run now through the presentation?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great. So let me explain the center of the idea of the Black Swan, and as explained in the book. And the Black Swan being part of the Inserto, 5-volume, so far 5-volume book, plus technical papers and academic work associated with it. So the center of the idea is the difference between what I call Mediocristan and Extremistan. So let me explain the difference. We are used to variables like Mediocristan that vary, but not too much. So just to explain, to give you the thought experiment in the beginning of the Black Swan, if I gather 1,000 people, invite them, to New York, and there's a lot of, room in hotels in New York. Okay, so it could be a good idea. Put them on a scale and weigh them. And then I add to that scale a rare event, a consequential rare event, the largest possible person I can find on the planet. How much of the total will that person represent? Or in other words, how much will the total change? Peanuts, 0.3%, maybe 0.4%, if I have the heaviest person on the planet. Okay. Now, if I have 10,000 people, it'll be 0.04%. So basically, when you have a large sample and you have a lot of variables, so you have it's an environment in which exceptions do not cost you much. They can happen. They do not represent a big share of the total. Now, when I move to Extremistan, it's a complete different class of random variables. And that's not one that was examined in schools too much by the people who know statistics 101, but your grandmother knows very well what's going on. So in Extremistan, okay, things can be determined by the extreme. Let's play the same thought experiment and have the same 1,000 people. We brought them to New York randomly from the planet. And let's take their net worth, total net worth. If you're lucky, you get $200,000. Given what's going on a planet and some areas on the planet where people don't make a lot of money. So you get maybe $1 million if you're lucky in that sample, total net worth. And then you add Jeff Bezos. Okay. So the fluctuation in the price of Amazon in the last nanosecond exceed the net worth of the balance, right? So basically he'd be 100%. Okay. And or you can take, you have 4 or 5 people representing 90-some% of the total wealth. I mean, the bottom net worth, the bottom 3-4 billion have less than in total the net worth of Bezos. So you realize what's going on with concentration. So you have concentrated random variables. So I posited in the Black Swan that you have a switch towards extremistan by a lot of things, becoming even more from extremistan. Owing to what? Well, from the fact that we no longer have islands. And when you switch from an island to a continent, when you join island together, okay, you have a drop of diversity and an increase of winner-take-all effects. So in the old days, no connectivity, the Google would not have survived. Harry Potter would not have been read in Lebanon, okay, 100 years ago. So and then the same thing then, therefore, will apply to pandemics. And that was on the Black Swan. You explain how pandemics will experience that winner-take-all effects as we are increasing connectivity. We are the more connected we are, and that's of course, Sanjeev's specialty, complexity theory, the more you have to look at it from a standpoint of complexity theory or theory associated with it. There are 7 or 8 different branches, but they all converge to the same point, that you have networks, and these networks lead to concentration. Okay. So just like we had opera singers making a good living in the 1800s, okay, and then by 1995, Pavarotti and a few others were making 90% of the income. Same thing for soccer players, you call it football players in UK English. So basically, the same happened. So now let's look at the effect of connectivity on diseases. There are villages in the UK. This is 330 years, okay? But in fact, I can go to 600 years. There are villages in the UK, in England, okay, that were reached by the bubonic plague between 300 and 600 years later. Just to tell you that connectivity was low. And of course, the Americas were not reached by the bubonic plague, you see, because you had the island effect. Today, we no longer have an island effect. So think about the classes of diseases we are about to have and how different they are from what we're used to traditionally. That is, that you got more from extremistan because of connectivity, you have conferences that bring people from the whole world to Las Vegas. Like you literally have conferences, and I've attended some where people come from 120 countries. Okay. So, and then think about it. 3 days later, you're redistributing a disease to 120 countries. So what you have, the bubonic plague at its fastest was traveling 30 miles a day. Okay, and look what's happening today. So basically, we live in a different world, more from extremistan, with winner-take-all effects for diseases. Meanwhile, our grandmothers know that. At least my grandmother, my grandfather, my granduncle as well. They understand the point. But some people who learned a little bit of statistics immediately thinks in terms of mediocristan. So what I call fortune cookie science or fortune cookie thinking. When this fellow, in the beginning of COVID, we were fighting this misunderstanding of the properties of multiplicative things as compared to static, non-multiplicative risks. GDP of the Suez Canal, okay, being blocked today as compared to 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. Because the more trade and the more connectivity, the more the weakest link affect us. And here, natural catastrophes have played a larger role. Now, it's what I call this large movie theater with a small door effect. So economically, this is why the impact of some things can be greater. But this is not all bad news. Now let's look at how the ancients dealt with it. The ancients had a hugely developed mechanism of lockouts, not lockdowns, lockouts, quarantines. The minute they heard of a rumor of any disease spreading anywhere, they enforced quarantine laws. So, for example, the Ottoman Empire you wanted to go from India to anywhere controlled by the Ottoman, you had somewhere between 7 and 18 days of quarantine, depending on what they deemed was a risk. And that lasted for hundreds of years. Between the Habsburg Empire, this is called a lazaretto, it was peppered. The whole border between the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire was peppered with places like that, where they put you in for 40 days, up to 40 days. It's called a quarantine, because it was up to 40 days, where they put the travelers. So just to make sure that what little connectivity they had did not harm them as much as what happened during Justinian's plague and, of course, the Great Plague in the 1300s. So basically, they understood. So now, let's say the ancients understood how to do it. Every port had quarantine. This is in Venice, for example. Some are nicer, of course. The Italians always had things nicer than other Mediterraneans, but it's the same concept applied everywhere around the Mediterranean. Marseille, Genoa, Beirut has a neighborhood called a quarantine, because all the ships had to start to Beirut, and people had, because of the Ottoman law, had to be quarantined. So now what's happening, I conclude with the following, that something tells me that something in the East, and the East, I count myself as a Mediterranean, as part of the East, because this is our block of culture. We do not like geronticide. So I'm going to say that our grandparents, of course, would have understood the difference between COVID and drowning in the swimming pool, that something is multiplicated. They probably would not be able to articulate it, but they understood it. Likewise, they had moral values that have been absent in Northern Europe during this. So something tells me that the countries that did well through COVID would continue to do well in the future, whether economically, health-wise, medically, or I would say ethically. So because this idea of geronticide, of killing the elderly, is absolutely absent in Eastern and Indian and Mediterranean culture. And you can see what the respect we have for the elders, whereas Europe decided to say, okay, at some point, let's do herd immunity and let the elderly die. People don't realize that the word senator means elderly in Latin, and the word sheikh in Arabic means the eldest. So your seniority in society is inverse to what it is today in traditional societies, and you keep the elders because of their wisdom, because at least they can explain to you that this policy is wrong, and we're losing that. So that was my conclusion, and thank you very much for letting me present the main points of the Black Swan, and to insist that if there's something that's not a Black Swan, it is a pandemic. Thank you.
Right. Nassim, I'll come back to you, but the key takeaway, Sanjeev, from what Nassim just mentioned, is that obviously with the kind of connectivity that we have, we are going to we'll keep getting into situations where we'll have to deal with such pandemics. But I think the most important point that he made, and I think probably you can throw some light on it from Indian point of view, because obviously there have been discussions that while India is vaccinating the elderly people, and the workforce which is actually moving around, probably spreading the disease, they are not receiving the vaccines. What I'm hearing from Nassim is actually quite contrary to that argument, that we should actually start vaccinating the elderly first. First of all, your response on that.
So I just heard the wonderful presentation, and let me show you how almost all the things that he talked about are parallel in many ways to the way we think about it and the kinds of policies we take. So for example, in the beginning of his presentation, he talked about the fact that, look, the world is becoming increasingly more connected.
Right.
And there are network effects, and the transmission consequently of shocks is much faster and more powerful. The unintended butterfly effects, etc., will therefore be also quite more frequent and so on. Now, how does this inform the way we make policy? Now, first of all, note that pandemics and viruses are not the only kind of these shocks. There are all kinds of other such shocks. So you can have financial shocks. We are hyper-connected, and a financial shock in one part of the world transmits through the rest. You can have supply chains break down. You just have a problem right now in the Suez. 100 years ago, this would have been an academic problem to somebody sitting in Delhi, but it's not. I mean, it will mess up all kinds of production systems around the world just because one ship got stuck somewhere on the Suez. So these are now things that transmit through these networks around the world. Now, this is a good context in which we can think about Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliant India, if you translate it loosely into English, is very often presented as some sort of a return to pre-1991, import substitution. This is totally not the case. I have absolutely no interest in driving around in an ambassador car. But we do think that you need to invest much more into resilience than you would if you were taking a sort of more neoclassical kind of view of the world. So unlike, for example, what many economics textbooks will tell you or many MBA courses will teach you, complexity theory people are not merely concerned with efficiency. We are just as concerned with resilience, because our worldview is naturally all about random shocks and things going wrong. So consequently, we think a lot about this. And so let me show you how Atmanirbhar Bharat can be thought of in a different way.
So just one second. So are you somewhere suggesting that too much of efficiency is actually counterproductive?
Without taking into account random shocks, yes.
Right. Nassim, you want to add to that? You're saying something.
Yeah, I want to add, it's very simple. If you drive 50 miles an hour, you'll be okay arriving to destination. If you drive 500 miles an hour, the odds of getting to destination become zero. So this idea of speed, for example, so the fastest way to drive may be 50 miles per hour, you see, or 60 miles or 100 miles per hour, not 500. Likewise, the most efficient way, it's effectively, there's a difference between cosmetic efficiency, what I call pseudo-efficiency, and risk-adjusted efficiency. If you adjust by risk, okay, so you get different results, and that's the resilience that our friend is talking about.
So let me explain this. Yeah. Let me explain it exactly in these ways. About a year ago, we discovered that India, for all its fame as a pharmaceutical to the world, producing generics for the world and so on, we were totally dependent on single sources, particularly in China, for certain APIs and inputs into our pharmaceutical industry. Now, if we, for example, now what we are doing is trying to encourage at least the key ones to be made in India. Now, this is not protectionism in the traditional way. What we are really trying to do is to increase the resilience of a globally competitive industry. This is not import substitution in the Nehruvian sense at all. And so same sort of concept goes, for example, in our view of social capital. India has survived this shock, at least in part because of our social capital, the fact that even today our family systems and traditions, etc., are intact. Anybody here will be able to tell you that, family was a very important part of it. And that is, again, what Nassim was talking about. We have ingrained in our culture this idea of protecting family, but also the older members of the family. They can't be sacrificed, so to speak, for efficiency, which maybe some other Northern European societies may be willing to do. We won't do it because it would be a breakdown of our family contract, so to speak. Would you agree, Nassim?
Exactly. I mean, the whole idea is that of intergenerational commitment. Okay. For example, I treat my parents in a way that I would like my children to treat me, and my grandchildren to treat my children. So you have these pacts, these intergenerational pacts that have arisen in the East, okay, with what we call the silver rule or the golden rule, that have unfortunately been eradicated by a bad economic culture that spread in Northern Europe over the past since neoclassical economics. What I call the naive version of it, started spreading there. The fact that we believe in efficiency, we believe in, but it can't be too naive. That's the point.
Right. Coming back to the post-COVID opportunity for India, and Nassim, I want to know your views here. One part is how India responded to the threat of COVID. In fact, today as we speak, we are dealing with almost, if I may use the word, second wave. But the way I look at it, the economy is moving, things are moving. We don't require a national lockdown the way we did last year. So obviously, a lot of thought process has gone behind this whole mechanism, and Sanjeev, I'll come to you for that. But Nassim, what I want to know is, you mentioned that the companies and countries which were effective in dealing with COVID are going to do better in the coming decade or in the coming years. If you can elaborate on that point.
Exactly. So I classify things in four categories: those who did well under COVID and will do well in the future; those who did well under COVID but we're not sure because it could be transitory; those who did poorly under COVID, like dentists, but or plastic surgeons, or your family doctor, but will do well later. Okay, because the demand, or tourism, for example, and then of course the category of those who did poorly under COVID and will do poorly after. So let's focus on the first two categories: those who did well under COVID. Anyone in technology would tell you, okay, that COVID has been a blessing for them. And I'm going to give an example of two kind of people. There's this waiter in the restaurant I go to often, who, of course, New York, shut down the restaurant, lost a job. So called up to say, hey, can I offer some help? Say, are you kidding? What? I'm making 3 times at least the money I was making before. Say, what? Say, yes. How? Delivery, my friend. So you have two kind of people. Those who, when they're hit with something at the individual level, okay, they sit down and wait for the government to come rescue them, okay, and they become hopers. And then you have category of people who say, okay, there got to be some money to be made there. Let's make lemonade out of this lemon. There got to be some opportunities. There's got to be wins. Let's build windmills. Okay, so that category of people, and you see them around. I saw another friend, same thing. He has a gym, and of course, gym were hit the hardest in America, and because you can't go to the gym, you still can't go to the gym. And so I called him up. He said, "I'm making a fortune." Setting up gyms in people's homes. Okay, and luckily I bought the equipment before these distortion supply chain, because you can't buy weights here. They're all made in China, and you have to wait 6 months. Anyway, so you have categories of people. So you can generalize to companies. Some companies have done well under COVID. So, and I think that some individuals have thrived, even family-wise under COVID. They know how to work Zoom, home office. So the first category, those who did well under COVID and will do well in the future, also, as I said, apply to countries. The countries that have done the best are Asian countries, who showed a lot of maturities in dealing with it. They understand liberty. Even Australia, I mean, okay, so maybe it's not very connected, so they benefited from being an island, but nevertheless, they showed that people in that part of the world, whether north or south, have shown an extremely high amount of wisdom. And then you see the foolishness from Sweden to the United States under Trump, to the Northern Europe, some other parts like Northern, like France, even France now under Macron. So you see the foolishness of what's happening, and the lack of understanding of the urgency, and these false dichotomies. They think, oh no, it hurts the economy to have. It doesn't hurt the economy to have lockdown. The Chinese proved that you help the economy by having lockdowns, provided you react quickly. So that first category, I think, is countries that did well, and then let's look at companies that did poorly under COVID and do poorly in the future. There are going to be some permanent changes in both consumer habits, okay, and professional practices. Like, for example, the COVID, effect is seen in real estate, where you have an extraordinarily large amount of real estate for supplied in New York office space, because an office is a great place to work, but if you can work from home, the combination allows you to have a smaller office space and larger home office. So that reallocation is going to be completely because this a little bit of because of nonlinearity is going to be very disruptive to New York City. We already see crime rising. We see white collar flight. We see real estate prices collapsing in New York City, and this odds are will be permanent. I don't understand why people should put up with 2.5-hour commute if they can work on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday out of their house. So and they understand, and I think the real estate prices understand that very well. The problem of cities like New York is that, as we saw in the 70s, there's a feedback loop that as people get out of New York, you end up with the elements, the dangerous elements in New York, completely uncontrolled. And so it leads to so that some areas are going to be hurt permanently by it, some areas helped permanently by it, and one part of the economy that's going to be hurt very badly without any recovery is the U.S. Education. Okay, because let's think about it. Now people have learned that I can take a class from probably the best statistician in the world at the Indian Statistical Institute while sitting in my home in New York, rather than go to a local university and pay $70,000 a year. Okay, so you have a substitution that will change U.S. education, which has been too expensive, and its dominance is unjustified, given that most of the faculty is from other countries.
An interesting point. Nassim, what I want to know is, Sanjeev, what I want to know is, like Nassim rightly mentioned, that if you get lemon, you got to make lemonades or you can crib about it. The various measures that Indian government has taken, right from Atmanirbhar Bharat to PLI schemes to even the vision which we saw in the budget. And it's quite clear that the next decade is actually going to be a decisive decade for India. One is, are we conscious about this, and are we actively pursuing certain policies which can actually create post-COVID opportunities for India? And if yes, then how?
So I think many of the things he just mentioned here definitely inform the way we think about the world. There's no question that the post-COVID world is not a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. I mean, it'll have its own technology, consumer behavior, geopolitics, all kinds of things that supply chains will change, and so on. And the key thing here is to understand that there is no way I, as a policymaker, can guess where this is all going. So what do I do? So what we have opted to do is to do this huge amount of supply-side measures. I know, many people are puzzled, why is it that in the middle of all of this, is the Indian government putting in so much effort into doing supply-side measures, deregulation, privatization, labor laws, farm law changes, and so on. We have been criticized from quite a lot. This is not the right time to do this. But in fact, we would argue this is the right time to do this. Because if you're going to go into the complete darkness, you want your factor markets to be as flexible as possible to be able to take advantage of the changes that are going to happen. And there's no way, as I said, I can predict where this will go. I can take a few bets, like through PLI schemes and so on. But overall, many of the jobs, the opportunities of the future are unknown. What do I do as a policymaker? Well, I can put in maybe some physical infrastructure, which is likely still to be relevant, airports and things like that. I don't think airports are just about going to go obsolete. They could, but I think they'll be still relevant. So I can invest in airports. I can invest in power production and renewables and things like that, maybe. So we are, by the way, putting in huge amount of effort, as you know, into physical infrastructure. We can put in some resources into health. That's clearly something that's important, irrespective of the pandemic. But by and large, what we need to do is to open things up so that they can be an adjustment to the new environment, taking advantage of natural creative destruction, so to speak. And of course, leveraging the animal spirits of the private sector. So if you listen to what, for example, the Honorable Prime Minister has been saying recently, we've got to be able to support wealth creation and innovators and risk takers. And of course, the frustration then consequently also on those things that get in the way, including bureaucracy, which tends to be, try and slow this readjustment. So I think the ideas that you just heard from Nassim are very much part of the way we think about very similar lines of thought. Not surprisingly, we are both complexity theory enthusiasts. So, but it is a lot about flexibility, dealing with uncertainty, randomness, and unpredictable spread of effects through networks. All of this is very much a part of our thinking process.
Right. Nassim, last year when you visited India for India Economic Conclave, I remember one of your comments that probably countries like India need to create a mechanism where it is easy for companies to fail. It is easy for entrepreneurs to fail because then you encourage them to take risks without suffering that kind of heavy, I would say, social and financial costs. Now in the post-COVID scenario, and like you rightly said, that a lot of things are going to change permanently. What is your view? And which are the sectors where probably we need to focus?
It's even more so. I mean, now that if you see the sectors that in which failure was something extremely well accepted, the technology, well, technology fared very well. And when we look at the numbers in America, you see, the stock market is rallying. The stock market is not rallying. Technology stocks are rallying, and as they're getting a bigger share of capitalization. We're switching. The American economy, okay, has been dominated now by technology firms, more so than last time. So my logic to re-explain it to our friends and listening and or watching is as follows. People are afraid of failure. So if you take the most active sector, okay, in the most active country in the world, America has the highest bankruptcy rate in the world. And in America, the sector with the highest bankruptcy rate is technology, okay? And it's the most vibrant one. So now, this requires a complete different way of thinking. So in Europe, it was plagued by, and of course India as well, Europe is plagued by people who want to help the economy by becoming civil servants. Okay, when you're a good student, okay, failing is not an option. But in real life, it's completely different. So you have to encourage people to fail. And if they want to help the planet, go start a business. Okay, start a business. You're helping the planet a lot more because we need people with the guts to fail. You need to make it socially acceptable for people to try, fail, try again, fail again, okay, until they succeed. And without that, we're not going to get anywhere. You end up having good students who you send them to Harvard, they come back, and then they're going to work for a salary. It's nice to have people work for a salary, but the problem is someone got to generate a salary somewhere, and that person is the entrepreneur. So if you look at the countries where it's easy to fail, you will see growth. If you look at a country where it's not easy to fail, once in a while you see some big investment-generated growth and things taper off.
Sanjeev, are we doing enough? This is a very important point because if the next decade is actually going to decide our destiny with median age of 29 for Indians, then I think this is the most important point that he's making. What is your response to that?
I totally agree with it. We need a system, if you want a creative destruction-based system, then we do need to have a system where you allow for continuous failure for those who do not adjust. And if they're not flexible, they die. So that is that is definitely a very important part of how we think about it also. So remember that this government, one of the most important reforms it did and put a lot of effort into it was the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And, very different from the earlier approach of using a BIFR as a warehouse to keep zombie companies alive. In the past, that was thought of the correct way to keep sort of jobs alive and assets alive. Far from it, the new approach, which is using the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, take companies through. If people want to buy it, great. Otherwise, liquidate them. This actually is a much better thing to do. And we need to be willing to do this also at every level. So, for example, while we have done this now for the big companies, we need to take this down, for example, to the lower level where we need to allow very poor people who owe tiny amounts of money a fresh start by declaring bankruptcy. Now, the Bankruptcy Code incidentally has this provision. It hasn't been actualized, but I think we one of the things we now need to do is to actualize the debt recovery process at the bottom to allow poor people to declare themselves bankrupt. Now, there is obvious misuse in it, but then an Aadhaar-based system can easily limit it. But to give people a fresh start after failure at every level of society, not just the big industry guys, but also the poorest person in the system, is a very important part of the process of allowing continuous creative destruction at every level of society. So I totally agree with this. And of course, privatization is also a part of that process. Many of these companies were private companies. We nationalized them for a variety of reasons at a point in time, good or bad. But I think now the time has come that other than in those areas which we consider strategic, and we have listed those out, that the private sector, these public companies should go out and compete with the private and be out there and go through the same creative destruction process. It makes the system, by the way, overall far more efficient. Just to give an example, since we're comparing America with India, as it happens to be America, for all it allowing all this creative destruction to happen in technology, does not allow it to happen in the airlines industry.
Right.
In India, we do. As a result of which, our airlines are just radically better. And yet, in the last 20, 30 years, think of the number of Indian airlines that have gone bust. Modi Luft, Jet, Kingfisher, etc. And yet, there's no doubt that the new airlines like Vistara have come and taken that space, and our airlines are just vastly superior. I mean, Vistara has no equivalent in the US. I mean, the best US airlines is just poor, is the best word I can use for it.
This is wonderful because we're plagued. I mean, the three industries that have been helped in America by the government, propped up artificially, were initially the car industry, then the banking industry, and now the airline industry. Or since September 11, the airline, now second time. Then you realize there's the three industries that are that are the worst. We make the worst cars, or made the worst cars for a long time. We have the worst. And given a choice, I'd rather ride than any non-US on any non-US airline. So look at the structure of what the exceptions in America. Look what happened to them.
Now, this brings me, I think, to the most important point that you need to make and tell our audience in India. Are we looking at a solid, serious, sustainable post-COVID boom, especially in India and across the world?
I mean, it depends on what happens to the COVID part 2. Okay, so, but I think that that COVID has given a lot of countries, I mean, I cannot talk specifically for India, talk in general, a lot of countries, some kind of impetus. What happened after, I don't know if you're aware what happened after 1945. You had a boom, okay, some led by investment, Marshall Plan, some just like, boom because people started overspending, getting out of their house and spending on things, okay? So likewise, we're going to have a worldwide phenomenon if, of course, conditional on dealing with COVID. But the story is not over. So I don't want to be caught making an unconditional statement, but a conditional one, conditional on finishing, being done with COVID. But one good thing I would say about surviving COVID as well is that now we've learned how to deal with the next pandemic. So the next pandemic is not going to be as costly, and would be aware of its existence, we're aware of what to do early to kill it in the egg early on. Now, economically, I can't really, I'm not an expert on India nor an expert on economics. I'm a risk person and of course, a mathematical modeler for complex nonlinear systems. But I would say that the vibes you get from India are great. And then think about it, you have learned the pharmaceutical industry in India that can supply the rest of the world. And India as well with things. So you may have some kind of how would I say, positive shocks for a bunch of industries, that will to grow. And then also, as I was saying, that you may have less of a brain drain. I mean, you guys have been supplying now practically little by little every head of U.S. successful technology company with an Indian CEO. At some point, it got to stop and keep him in India. And the structure of the new world, and as our friend Sanjeev was saying, it's not the reiteration of an old world, new world. You can hire employees. Microsoft can hire employees overseas. Just like you could be a remote in Seattle, okay, working for a company in San Francisco, you could be a remote in Bangalore or any place they're working for a company in the US. And the big mistake Donald Trump made is by restricting visas, he thought he was increasing domestic employment. No, that's a silly move. By restricting visas, he encouraged US companies. Now we know how to work remote, so physical presence is no longer that important. And so you're gonna be, I mean, you will depend less on demand from, I mean, you'll depend, of course, on demand from overseas, but less than domestic demand. But this will be an icing on a cake, you see, having US companies hire Indians who live in India and stay in India, and perhaps later on may start their own companies in India. So the solution, may come from overseas, thanks to Zoom, and the idea, the side effect of COVID.
Right.
I mean, COVID has a lot of bad side effects physically, but it has one positive side effect: is I'm sitting in New York now, talking to you in Delhi, without having to incur jet lag. And a lot of companies have employees in India today working for a US company, because we didn't know before how to work
Downside,
remote.
Nassim, I would say to that is you're missing out on Indian food, which you love.
Yes, my passion for Indian food, and with all respect for Indian restaurants in New York, not the same. The yogurt will never. They can replicate probably the chicken, but the yogurt will never ever be the same. For the right time, never.
That's true. We'll try and have you here as soon as possible. Sanjeev, you want to add to what he just mentioned?
I mean, he's right in many things on this, in that obviously there are some things in which we can predict the dynamics to some extent. I mean, one obvious one is that at least in the technology, oh my God, H-1B visas are being restricted, that this is a bad thing for Indian industry. I have frankly never understood, not never, at least certainly in recent times, it makes no sense at all. Because if you don't need to go to your office to get work done, why do you need to go to America, right? So I think this is important because it does mean that we can, if we get our policies right, be able to compete with the best in the world by staying here. And so that requires us to obviously deregulate, have sensible tax rates, tax policies, and so on. But it does mean that the technology has now reached a stage that for certain industries, we are now super competitive. We have to get out there and take advantage of it. Now, whether or not the world itself will go through a boom, I don't know, because I am, I look at it as complete uncertainty. So in that sense, I am only playing for simply being as flexible and take advantage of the opportunities as we can, assuming that the way the world will turn out to be could be very, we don't know whether we are after the First World War or after the Second World War. So even after the First World War, you did get a decade of boom, the roaring 20s, but it did end badly. So I continue to be a little more uncomfortable with where the world may end up, because I genuinely believe there's no predetermined path. But I do think that if we pay attention and are flexible, and I keep saying that flexibility will always beat strength in the medium term in a complex, uncertain world. I think if we are flexible, keep our eyes on the ball, and are willing to change policy, and if we maintain social cohesion, and I keep coming back to social capital as an important thing, then we are in a great place.
I would add one thing that what you say is a bonus you get from having people work in India for a U.S. technology company is the transfer of entrepreneurial spirit, and these people will start companies in India. You see, the probably hire people in the U.S., but the idea of the world becoming flatter thanks to Zoom, as we're witnessing now, is to be taken seriously. You got to take it as logical consequence.
Right. Nassim, one word which you mentioned, which sort of alarmed me, and that's why let me ask you straight. What is your assessment from social point of view, from economy point of view, policy point of view, or even from Black Swan event point of view? Is worst behind us at this point in time?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. We have the mechanism to deal with the disease. Okay, with this disease, we have a mechanism to deal with future disease. We have people who were unwise in the beginning are becoming wise now. Like Sweden was unwise compared to Norway. Now they're becoming wise. You see, so hopefully, so I'm sort of like guardedly optimistic that we know how to deal. Even if COVID gets worse, that we know how to deal with it. Even Brazil, you know, that not in Brazil is becoming wiser. Okay, so there are signs, you know, that of maturity in the world that allows us to deal with these contingencies a little better. But we have to be careful. You see, that's what I'm saying. You have to be careful because there's a high amount of unpredictability. Mutations can happen, but we have to be careful. And I mean, on the positive side, of course, these vaccines can be adapted very quickly to the new strains. But I will stay careful. Plus, there's one thing that worries me is a segment of the population that is in worse ignorance than the Middle Ages. Like people who refuse vaccine, not understanding that vaccines are very risky, maybe. Right. But COVID, we know, has, particularly for young people, long-term risks that are very serious. They've got to take seriously. So in the trade-off, and then you have segments in France. Thanks to Twitter, thanks to social media, you have a spread of ignorance that makes me, you know, a little more cautious in my assessments of the future.
Let me put this to Sanjeev now. Sanjeev, what is your assessment from Indian economy point of view, or from Indian point of view? Because, like Nassim mentioned, we know better how to deal with this pandemic or how to deal with the disease, and we are better prepared, we have better infrastructure. In Indian context, are you confident that the worst is behind us?
Get another second wave. But remember, we're a different place than where we were a year ago. We have a much, much better idea of what this disease does. It turns out it's not as dangerous as maybe the worst case forecasts were. It is still dangerous, but we know in what way, to which demographic group. We know, for example, you need to keep track of people's oxygen levels. I had never heard of an oximeter before. Now everybody in this room will have an idea of what an oximeter is. So we have learned to deal with it. We now have vaccines, and as Nassim pointed out, these vaccines specifically may not be able to deal with every strain, but they can be updated to each strain. So again, we have some tools in place, we have protocols in place. So I think as far as specifically this COVID episode is concerned, we can probably now get away with localized lockdowns and without having to do something too drastic anymore. So that's the good news. But as far as if I'm looking very long term, will there be another shock like this, and will we again have human beings fail to respond to it? I'm quite certain this will happen. After all, pandemics had happened many times in the past, and we still took so long to be able to do things that maybe our ancestors would have considered routine. And so I am not so confident that just because we've learned how to deal with this particular shock, we will be, necessarily better equipped to deal with future shocks, unless we begin to change our mindsets itself and, stop having this, equilibrium-based efficiency model of the world in our heads. This is an extremely damaging thing. Whether, the difference between those who are neoclassical economists and socialists is not that they don't believe in this great equilibrium. They just disagree how to reach there. One of them thinks that the market will take them to this optimal equilibrium, and the socialists think that wise bureaucrats in the Planning Commission will take them to the optimal equilibrium. But they are both believers in the optimal equilibrium. The point about complexity theory is that we are very suspicious that there is any such thing, and that the whole world is naturally kind of groping its way into the future, and therefore we prefer this iterative process, creative destruction-based process, in order to make our way into the future. Therefore, huge premium to the ability to adapt.
Right. I think the key takeaway from this session is that we have to be prepared. The next catastrophe will come, if not pandemic, then something else. But we need to be ready for that and keep working towards probably a better future. At least in Indian context, this decade matters the most to us. Nassim, thank you so much for joining us on this session.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Sanjeev, thank you. And hope to see you soon in person, Nassim. Thank you so much.
First, it'll be my 12th visit to India in a decade and a half. And anytime I'm invited, I board the plane.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thanks.
Thanks.